So now I am alone in the world, with no brother, neighbor, or friend, nor any company left me but my own. That's how Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Reveries of a Solitary Walker begins. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about is exile, uh, alienation, solitude. Whether exile and alienation kind of imply involuntary nature of it, but yeah, I kind of want to just go through it a little because it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, for one reason or another. Um, One reason I've been thinking about it is because right now we're working on Blood Meridian in one of my classes on Southwest literature, and my teacher has said some anecdotes about McCarthy, which I heard last semester, and I knew some of them myself. But McCarthy is notoriously not um, extremely public, and this thread kind of runs through American literature, with William Gaddis being the same way. And Fernando Pessoa could also be considered that way, though. Uh, well, I can't imagine he wanted to be, you know, some public intellectual type, but he also wasn't very famous at all anyway. So, but with at least with Gaddis and McCarthy, it's a choice. They could have reasonably been more famous than they were just by doing readings and do whatever else everyone else does, but they didn't, and I don't know their reasons for it, but I do think the chance of being misunderstood is one of the main reasons why. And the closest way I could make an analogy for this is with David Foster Wallace. He constantly, when in interviews, he makes references to the fact that people ask him about his book. Um, but in many cases, he alludes to the fact that what he wrote in his book was as complex as it gets. Not as complex as an obscurant or something like that, but that is as precisely as he can put it, you know. And I think he's correct, but he's a different case because he, it seems, to some extent wanted to be a public intellectual or a public author, or at least wanted to be famous or something like that. Because he did many interviews and all this type of stuff, wrote in magazines, and you know, William Gaddis and Cormac McCarthy did not do that really to any meaningful extent. When they got older, they each did kind of one big interview. McCarthy did one with Oprah, which was terrible, and Gaddis did one with some British guy that was pretty bad itself, even though the British guy was much more sympathetic to Gaddis than Oprah was to McCarthy, which is a complete mismatch. It's unbelievable that he must have been forced to do it, and it's just ridiculous. But let's see. Kind of lost my thread there, but just speaking in general, broadening from McCarthy and Gaddis, that a lot of writers write about lonely people or solitary people, and I think that's mainly because a lot of writers themselves were solitary or lonely, and it may be I've always wondered if people like that, so to say, people like that end up becoming writers and writing about lonely people, or is it that, uh, let's say, very creative people who are also fairly intelligent uh, and want to do some artistic thing like writing end up being lonely and then write about it? And of course, it doesn't always have to split itself perfectly. It can be like they had a lonely moment, they became writers, and then it made them more lonely, and then they wrote about it more, and then they became more lonely. It can like pile on itself, or it could be some like precipitating factor or something like that that's not easily put down to their personality or their creative interest or whatever you would want to say. But I do think it's fairly unusual that at least most of my favorite writers, which does make it specific and can include problems there, but just seems like a lot of the best writers, one way or another, write about like just huge amounts of misunderstandings or loneliness. And I do think a lot of people go through loneliness in their life. But it seems like for a lot of writers, at least a lot of biographies I've read, it's relatively chronic. And not even necessarily that they're visionaries, but I do think that does not help. Because I was just looking into this British composer. I don't know how to say his first names, but his last name is Sorabji. His dad is from India, the Indian subcontinent, and his mother was English. And he was born in 1892. And he was somewhat a self-taught composer, but he also took a lot of classes. He's good at the piano. But he wrote these really idiosyncratic pieces for piano mostly. And some of them are extremely long. Some of them are very unusual. And in the I think it was the early 1930s, he basically became a recluse from everyone and just lived in this, I think it was called the Eye. I think that's what he called it. Some house in England. And he didn't really communicate with anyone until later. Some younger people found his music and became friends and all this stuff. But he was definitely innovative, and he was obviously very intelligent. And it's just that case where you wonder, is it because they're misunderstood so much that they become actively hostile towards people, but nonetheless still feel like that innate draw, but it ends up not being worth it to them? It's hard to say because just recently I found a book of selected poems by Robinson Jeffers. And I've been interested in his poetry for a while because he's, from the modernist era, although he was not a modernist himself, I would say. And there's a poem in here that is very interesting. It's titled "The Artist," and it's not too long. So I think, let's see here. Yeah, so I think I'll just go ahead and read it. It is a bit long though. Maybe take a couple minutes. An artist. That sculptor we knew, the passionate-eyed son of a quarryman, who astonished Rome and Paris in his meteor youth and then was gone, at his high tide of triumphs. Without reason or goodbye, I have seen him again lately after 20 years, but not in Europe. In desert hills I rode a horse slack-kneed with thirst. Down a steep slope a dancing swarm of yellow butterflies over a shining rock made me hope water. We slid down to the place. The spring was bitter, but the horse drank. I imagined wearings of an old path from that wet rock ran down the canyon. I followed. Soon they were lost. I came to a stone valley in which it seemed no man nor his mount had ever ventured. You wondered whether even a vulture'd ever spread sail there. There were stones of strange form under a cleft in the far hill. I tethered the horse to a rock and scrambled over. A heap like a stone torrent, a moraine, but monstrously formed limbs of broken carving appeared in the rockfall. Enormous breasts, defaced heads, of giants, the eyes calm through the brute veils of fracture. It was natural then to climb higher and go in, up the cleft gate. The canyon was a sheer-walled crack winding at the entrance, but around its bend the walls grew dreadful with stone giants, presences growing out of the rigid precipice that strove in dream between stone and life, intense to cast their chaos, or to enter and return. Stone-fleshed, nerve-stretched, great bodies, ever more beautiful and more heavy with pain. They seemed leading to some unbearable consummation of the ecstasy. But there, troll among Titans, the bearded master of the place accosted me in a cold anger, a mallet in his hand, filthy and ragged. There was no kindness in that man's mind, but after he had driven me down to the entrance he spoke a little. The merciless sun had found the slot now to hide in, and lit for the wick of that stone lamp bowl a sky almost, I thought, abominably beautiful. While our lost artist we used to admire, for now I knew him, spoke of his passion. He said, "Marble? White marble is fit to model a snow mountain, let man be modest. Nor bronze, I am bound to have my tool and my material, no irrelevances. I found this pit of dark grey freestone, fine-grained and tough enough to make sketches that under any weathering will last my lifetime. The town is 8 miles off. I can fetch food and no one follows me home. I have water and a cave. Here and no possible lack of material. I need, therefore, nothing. As to my companions, I make them. And models, they are seldom wanted. I know a Basque shepherd I sometimes use, and a woman of the town. What more? Sympathy? Praise? I have never desired them, and also I have never deserved them. I will not show you more than the spalls you saw by accident. What I see is the enormous beauty of things, but what I attempt is nothing to that. I am helpless toward that. It is only to form in stone the mold of some ideal humanity that might be worthy to be under that lightning. Animalcules that God, if he were given to laughter, might omit to laugh at. Those children of my hands are tortured because they feel, he said, the storm of the outer magnificence. They are giants in agony. They have seen from my eyes the man-destroying beauty of the dawns over their notch yonder, and all the obliterating stars. But in their eyes they have peace. I have lived a little, and I think peace marrying pain alone can breed that excellence in the luckless race might make it decent to exist at all on the starlit stone breast. I hope, he said, that when I grow old and the chisel drops, I may crawl out on a ledge of the rock and die like a wolf. These fragments are all I can remember. These in the flare of the desert evening, having been driven so brutally forth I never returned. Yet I respect him enough to keep his name and the place secret. I hope that some other traveler may stumble on the ravine of Titans after their maker has died. While he lives, let him alone. And that's the reason I've never sent a letter to McCarthy. But kind of going along with that, you can find several similar cases in history of someone like Rimbaud, for example, extremely intelligent, uh, extremely creative, ahead of his time by far, and completely kind of gives it up and just is gone. Goes and lives with these uh, uncultured people, teaching the Quran to uh, groups in Africa and stuff. Yeah, just that's a good example, but there are tons of people like it. Soren Kierkegaard. I was watching this lecture series that I guess was posted on Coursera, but I watched it on YouTube, and it talked about how Kierkegaard would, in school, always get picked on because he would get in arguments with kids and he would embarrass them because he would outsmart them so easily, and then they would try to beat him up and stuff after that. And you can just tell from his writings that he was a fairly lonely person. He felt that the Church of Denmark, I guess, whatever it was called, was doing things wrong, and in that way, and it's really tragic when he died. He died very young, and he was buried by the church that he spent most of his later years deriding, and his cousin tried to prevent it, but I think he was fined or something like that for trying to prevent the church from burying Soren. And it's tragic, completely tragic. And then another author that has a very tragic late life is Robert Musil, who was of course Austrian and lived through the 1930s in Austria, which was hard enough. And in the late 30s, he had to exile to Switzerland because I think his wife was Jewish, or he was part Jewish or something. But anyway, yeah, he had to leave, and I think it was something like only 7 people visited his funeral. And I have his diaries, and a lot of his early diaries are about basically feeling, in some sense, alone. Mostly, it seems, intellectually alone, because he did have several good friends when he was younger, in his early 20s, to talk to that he knew from when he was a child and things. But yeah, I think that's interesting. Of course, one of the main character in The Recognitions by William Gaddis is a reclusive painter who really has an extremely difficult time communicating with people. A lot of his dialogue is interlaced with ellipsis, and seems like he's always just baffled at trying to speak. And there's a good quote I read at the beginning of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. The trouble about progress is that it always looks much greater than it really is. I thought that was kind of funny. Because I've been watching a lot of videos by Eric Weinstein, and he's an interesting guy. He has some interesting ideas about economics. And in that way, I've been thinking about kind of the general idea of progress and like cultural progress, moral progress, technological progress, um, progress in general for humanity. And I can't, I couldn't say either way whether or not we are progressing as a whole, but you can split it into, technological progress. We can manipulate things better than ever before, and in some sense, that's all that technology is for. At least it was in the very beginning, and I think it continues to be that way when we were just monkeys in the middle of Africa, using stone tools to cut stuff or kill animals or something, manipulating the world. Now we can do it better than ever, and some sense, I suppose, that's progress. Moral progress, I think, is um, maybe the best one. And it's completely bizarre. We're stuck with old books that people draw their morality from. But the progress that I'm not sure is happening, although I suppose it's tied to those first two, is cultural progress. And what that explicitly means, I'm not sure. But I guess kind of like as a counterpoint to maybe what I'm about, not necessarily a counterpoint, but as one example of what I'm like the string I'm going in, is I've been one of my friends has been reading The Decline of the West by Spengler, and I've tried to read a little bit of it, and I just can't. I just I'm put off by the authoritative style of it. Um, this guy clearly thought he had everything figured out, and there's just something about that I find distasteful. But I'm sure I'll read part of it eventually, more of a historical document. But it's pretty obvious what his opinion was as far as cultural progress. And I guess what I would say is I think it's basically impossible to know. It's entirely too complex for a person to be able to take in um, whatever you would describe your culture as, like Western culture, let alone, like, American culture, German culture, Austrian culture, European culture, North American culture, South American culture, whatever. And then, one of those would be hard enough. And then trying to uh, extrapolate it to the whole West or the whole East or something. And I think so. That was published in 1918, and I think with a huge event like World War One, I think it would be much easier to let yourself fall into the idea that, oh, this is a sign. This certain event is a sign. But I think that's a weakness. Now, of course, I'm not trying to denigrate his work. I haven't read it, and so in that way, I can't critique it specifically. But I just think that people want symbols for things, uh, and I think it's usually they have an idea and then they look for a symbol for it. And anyone who thought there was a decline in humanity, and then you get World War One coming around, well, you don't need to look that hard for a symbol. But I think you can easily do it in the opposite direction, maybe just as foolishly, for something like technology, like, oh, we must be progressing as a human race because we can go to the moon or something like that. But really, what does that have to do with anything? It doesn't have anything to do with anything. It just kind of shows our, like, obsessive task of just stacking blocks up to the moon, but I don't think it actually does anything in and of itself. Technological progress, or even, you know, scientific progress. And I was thinking something interesting as far as economics go. I would wonder, and I didn't look this up, so I must not care that much, but I would wonder what the relation between the growth in population of a society and the rate of inflation is. Because you have a certain amount of people hitting like 18 at every moment, and they have to start being paid because they're expected to join the workforce. And as people are getting older, they earn more money. So, to some extent, the inflationary economics make sense because of that, because your population is growing, and unless you are extracting value from another place, like Spain did from the New World, or America did from, basically everywhere else after World War II, I think during those times you need like minimal inflation because you already have a lot in and of itself. But, more stagnant times, you would have to artificially inflate because you have, huge growth in population. And how would that work with schools? Because that's one thing Eric Weinstein said, that kind of Peter Thiel, and they're all related. Those types of guys, thinkers, and because it's interesting that education in America is stagnant in the sense that the same types of people are just being recycled. These people graduate college, have some kids, maybe half the kids go to college, half of them don't. Some drop out halfway and stuff, and so that means that there's not huge growth for teachers. So let's say you're a professor at university, you have however many graduate students, it doesn't really matter. There's really only one spot, so to say, in a self-sufficient system for a teacher, and one like apprentice type thing, or else they won't find positions. And that's not completely true because there are community colleges and maybe high schools or whatever, but in a general sense it's true. And I wonder how many people realize that if you're not like one of the best, you may as well give up, depending on what you want to do, of course. But yeah, so now at the end here, when all the people who don't care at all have gone, I've been thinking about this a lot because of my own situation. Because, I really don't have many friends, and as I've gotten older, I've found it harder to, in some sense, choose to be friends with people. Because I think most of the time it's me deciding I don't want to be friends or I don't want to be social. And I wonder, why do I want to do that? And there's no reason to go into like personal details, but it's partially because of some like specific events that have made me realize how little I need friends, due to like, effectively involuntary, like involuntary exile, that sort of thing, moving. And that's part of it, and I think a lot of people don't encounter that in life, so they're they're too afraid to not have friends. And so that's, I think, part of it. And then another part is just the basic fact that I'm an unusual person. Like, I think if you're a white, European heritage, 110 IQ, stay at home mom, dad in corporate business, older sister, younger brother, sort of stereotypical family. You have, accounting for everything else, an extremely good chance of finding someone like you who happens to be interested in the same things, and you came from similar backgrounds. You can understand each other perfectly, that sort of thing. It's not always the case that your friends are exactly like you, but they have to be in some deep sense. Otherwise, you wouldn't be friends with them. A lot of friends have similar IQs, similar, whether self-educated or education levels, all that type of stuff. And as you get to the outliers of whatever category you're in, I think it gets harder and harder to find people who you can be very good friends with. Now you can be almost, acquaintances with anyone, and that's easy enough. But I'm not sure. You can only get like the base necessity of socialization from that. You can probably get almost the same thing from working in a job that you have to look at people. Where you have to look at real live people. And I've heard stuff about oxytocin or stuff like that, where even looking at dogs, you can look at a dog's face and get something similar. So, I'm not sure how much that has to do with what I'm talking about, but it's like, it's this feeling that that quote I read by Rousseau in the very beginning. It's in some sense a misunderstanding, um, and it's not the case that if you're lonely you automatically some sort of visionary genius, obviously, but because there are a lot of idiot conspiracy theory guys who think, oh yeah, I must be sidelined for a reason. I must be right. It's just absurd. I watched this one on flat Earth, and it's frightening. But yeah, and I think it's unusual that a lot of my favorite writers have, as far as I can tell, fairly similar interests and similar personalities to me, and they were all lonely people too. It's not promising, I would say, in that respect. But I think, to a large extent, now you can get really poetic about it, and this isn't wrong, that, everyone is interesting, but they're interesting in a very specific way. Everyone can only be interesting in a very specific way. It's if you're observing them, or basically like pretending you are them. And that can only get you so far. I think some people are better at it than others, and it's fun to do. It's interesting. It's always interesting to do that, but it gets old. And I think you can always switch on and off doing it, and I think that's fair enough, whatever. But you can't do that very often because it's extremely draining, and you never know if you're onto something. Um, Although I think I do it fairly often compared to probably the average person, but yeah, it's easy in some sense. It's easy to say that there are no uninteresting people in the world, and as the alternative, it's also easy to say that most people are boring. But both things are true. It's very hard to find someone who's not interesting, but it's also very hard to find someone who's not boring. And this is one of the most difficult things I found as far as having good friends or having people I even want to interact with in any like meaningful sense. Like, yeah, you can small talk with anybody and it's fine. You get some enjoyment out of it, but that's just kind of like it's kind of like eating in some sense. Yeah, eating can be enjoyable, but if that's all you have, it's completely unsatisfying. You're just kind of fulfilling some mindless automata process that you have to do no matter what. And yeah, that's the thing I've been struggling with the most is it's like, are people really boring? And I think yes, they are. But then you can also see how tons of people are interesting. But then you think, well, I'm here anyway, so I might as well find them interesting sometimes and boring sometimes. And just try to find people who are the least boring possible. That's about as far as I can tell one of the main reasons for living. Yeah, but it's hard to say. All right, well, it's gone on long enough. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Well, also recommend me really good plays that you like. I was just watching Marasad by Peter Weiss, and I've been reading Shakespeare plays, and I just got into Michel de Gelderode. I don't know if that's right. The Belgian playwright that Ligeti based Le Grand Macabre, one of his operas based on Michel de Gelderode's play. Also been trying to get into the French dramatists like Racine Cornet and Moliere. Been wanting to get into more archetypal figures in Western culture like Don Juan, Faust, um, like Don Quixote, all those sorts of interesting things, Hamlet. So yeah, recommend me some good plays if you know any, if you think I'll like any. But all right, yep, that is a gang boss.